Welcome to Learn with Amine. In this video series, I'll be talking about what steps need to be taken to take up classes in a Day 1 CPT college. I will start with the final evaluation of the STEM OPT and what steps are required to apply for the SEVIS transfer out in the old school, SEVIS transfer in the new school, and what steps need to be taken with the help of the employer for the CPT authorization, and what needs to be done at the new school for the CPT authorization and getting a CPT I-20. So I will be presenting a step-by-step approach so that the students do not get confused and they perform all the required tasks in a timely manner, because Day 1 CPT, although it is a simple process, there are several steps that need to be performed in a timely manner so that you do not lose the days of employment on STEM OPT and you do not have a gap between the STEM OPT and by the time CPT gets kicked in the new school, because we want to optimize the days of unemployment, because some people might have some financial burden. Also, we do not want to go out of status. So please follow the video series closely to know what steps need to be taken in what timely manner in order to optimize your SEVIS transfer and CPT authorization in the new school. So let's get started. In this video section, I'll be talking about the SEVIS transfer out. So what is SEVIS transfer out? So this is basically the process of transferring your SEVIS ID from the old school to the new school. SEVIS transfer out usually comes when a student is nearing the end of the STEM OPT expiration. So after the STEM OPT expiration, a student has around 60 days grace period to leave the United States. Otherwise, it would be overstaying or staying illegally. And a student does not have any work authorization after the STEM OPT expiration date. So a student looks for ways and he or she can join a new program at a new school in order to extend his study. And that is where the SEVIS transfer out comes in. And this is basically the transfer of the same SEVIS ID that was on your F1 visa to a new school. So the SEVIS number remains the same, although the F1 visa stamp has expired. The SEVIS is active if you have never been out of the status. Now this is the SEVIS transfer process. So let me tell you, this is like a fair warning. You need to start this process 28 days before your actual SEVIS transfer date is going to be, and this is to ensure the smooth process. Since you don't want to be on an edge, I would request you to process the SEVIS transfer out request 28 days before your actual SEVIS transfer date for the smooth processing. So what does this mean? You basically have an idea of the SEVIS transfer date. It is going to be very near to the program start date, or it's going to be 1 month before the class start date. So about that time, you are going to transfer your SEVIS, and the SEVIS transfer out request that you are going to submit to the university, it has to be around 28 days. So let me explain you. By the end of this video, you understand why I'm saying this. Now the old school requires 14 business days to process SEVIS transfer out request smoothly. So old school might have some portal where you can request for several processes pertaining to your F1 visa, and one of that request is called as SEVIS transfer out request, and the old school wants you to submit that request online 14 business days. Now think about it, 14 business days is actually 20 days including the weekends or any holidays that comes during Thanksgiving weekend or the Christmas weekend. So it's actually 20 days. So you need to count those also, and additional 8 days. Why am I asking you to start this process is because for the SEVIS transfer out process, you also need to do the final evaluation of your STEM OPT. That is filling the part 2 of the page 5 of the I-983 form. You need to fill that and you need to get it signed by the employer. That actually takes around 7 days because the employer and you have to align on the text that is going to be filled, and then you have to sign the document and then the employer has to sign. That takes around 7 days. So that means you need to start this process 28 days before. And for the SEVIS transfer out request, there are some details that need to be filled in on the portal of your old school. Few of the details can be answered by yourself. Those are very easy details. Now, when I'm talking about the SEVIS transfer out request, I'm assuming that you have an acceptance or the admission letter from the new school. So after that, you will be doing the SEVIS transfer out, because you also need the new school details such as the name and address. Now you might be asking me, what should be the address of the new school? Because new school might have multiple branches across the United States. Usually the day one CPT colleges, they have around 3 campuses across US, spreading across 3 different states. So you need to fill the address of the main campus in the SEVIS transfer out request, because in the SEVIS transfer out request they will be asking you for the campus name as well. So basically, if there are any satellite campuses for the new college, you need to enter that campus name in the campus name field. And there will be other questions such as enrollment semester and year. You might have decided because you already have the acceptance letter, and the acceptance letter is for a particular semester and the particular year. Then you would know your details such as name, date of birth, address, email ID. The personal email address needs to be given, country of birth, then signature and date. These are the required details that you can answer by self. Now, SEVIS transfer out request, it is going to be submitted to a old school. Now you cannot assume that only old school is involved in this process, because the old school, new school and employer also are involved very actively in this process. So different components are required from different entities. So I am going to explain about that. If you are watching this video, whatever the details I'm asking you to email the new school for, please do that and get the answers beforehand, so that you don't have to wait for them to answer those details in the future while you are actually applying for the process. So the required details that can delay your application. So first question that might be answered is, does new school require old school to complete a transfer form? So this question will be asked in your SEVIS transfer out request. So you need to get answer from the new school beforehand, because sometimes the new school, they require some form that needs to be filled by the old school for the SEVIS transfer. Nowadays, most of the new colleges do not require such form. There is only one form, SEVIS transfer out form. There is no SEVIS transfer in form. In some of the cases, there is SEVIS transfer out for the old school, and then there is SEVIS transfer in for the new school, and that SEVIS transfer in form might be required to be filled by the old school, and this requirement is put in place by the new school. So you need to ask the new school regarding this question. So they might say, we don't require the old school to complete any transfer in form. So that would be helpful in the process. And also you need to ask the new school's campus code. Now, for example, your university is from Indiana, but you want to attend the campus that is there in Detroit, and the Detroit campus, not just the name, there is the Detroit campus code, which is also called as SEVIS code for the campus, and that detail need to be entered in the SEVIS transfer out form. And this SEVIS code format is usually starting with first 3 letters, and then there are 3 numbers, then there is a letter, and then there are 8 numbers. So this is the SEVIS code format. Usually this is available in the new school acceptance letters, or if it is not present in the acceptance letter, then you need to get this answer from the new school beforehand, because if you don't have this detail, you cannot fill it by yourself. Now the most important is the final evaluation form, which is I-983. You need to fill it, get it signed by the employer. You need to sign it as well before the employer signs it, and it takes around 7 to 8 days for the employer to fill this, because there has to be an alignment between the employer and you on the progress text, and the form needs to be signed by you, and then it is signed by the employer's HR department or the immigration team or the manager. So it takes around 7 days, so consider that as well. Now next question that you cannot fill by yourself is SEVIS transfer date. Okay, and this date is basically required in the SEVIS transfer out form, because the old school is going to schedule your SEVIS transfer out based on the date that you give, and this date needs to be pre-decided, and you can decide this with help of the new school. So either you can contact the DSO that has been assigned to you, and if the DSO has not been assigned, then you need to contact the International Student Helpline or email or phone number that the new school has given you, and you need to specifically ask them what is the SEVIS transfer deadline for this semester in which I have enrolled and admitted to. So they will be mentioning you the SEVIS transfer deadline, that it needs to be 2 weeks before the classes start date. So you need to remember that SEVIS transfer deadline, and based on that you can decide the SEVIS transfer date. And I'm going to help you with the SEVIS transfer date using multiple scenarios. So let's take a look at the scenario. In the first scenario, let us consider that there are two dates, program start date and the class start date, which are different and spread 1 month across usually. And then you have your STEM OPT expiration date. And assume in this particular scenario that your STEM OPT expiration date is falling between the program start date and the class start date. Then what should be my SEVIS transfer date? So that is the question. So the answer is the SEVIS transfer date should be between the program start date and the SEVIS transfer deadline, both of which are inclusive. As you can see, here is the equal sign, and here also it's an equal sign. So the SEVIS transfer date might be equal to program start date, or it might be after the program start date, and it has to be before the SEVIS transfer deadline or on the SEVIS transfer deadline. So you need to ask your new school about the SEVIS transfer deadline. Usually the SEVIS transfer deadline will be before the class start date. And you need to remember that you cannot work from the day of the SEVIS transfer date. Now with this, there is a conflict between the SEVIS transfer date and the STEM OPT expiration date. So the previous employment should end the day before SEVIS transfer. So in the SEVIS transfer out request form, the old school will be asking, have you ended your previous employment? You need to say yes, and they will ask what is the employment end date, and you need to mention the day before the SEVIS transfer date. And now considering this, if you don't want to lose any of the days on the STEM OPT, then the optimal date of the SEVIS transfer would be the day after the STEM OPT expiration date. But you need to be beware of any holidays at colleges or with your employer, because usually these days fall into the holidays of Christmas or Thanksgiving or the summer holidays, and you need to keep your current or CPT company informed that you are going to do the SEVIS transfer on the day after the STEM OPT expiration date, and you will be providing the I-9 re-verification document soon if you want to renew the job at the current employer. So this is how it works. Now let us consider scenario 2. In the scenario 2, we are considering that the program start date and the class start date are before the STEM OPT expiration. Now in this case, what should be my SEVIS transfer date? So SEVIS transfer date should be again lying between the program start date and the service transfer deadline, irrespective of your STEM OPT expiration, because you have selected a program or a semester that begins before your STEM OPT expiry. So the mistake lies with you. You have selected a program that is before your STEM OPT expiration. So you are going to lose your STEM OPT days in this case. But sometimes it is understandable, because sometimes your STEM OPT expiration is on a particular date, and soon after that there is no program starting in any of the other colleges which are close by. So this case is also understandable. So in that case also, program start date should be less than or equal to the service transfer date, which is less than or equal to service transfer deadline. In other words, service transfer date should lie between the program start date and the service transfer deadline, and this deadline is again asked to the new school. You cannot work from the day of the service transfer date. Your previous employment should end the day before the service transfer date, and the optimal solution in this case does not exist. You will lose days of STEM OPT in this case. So you need to understand this. And then let's go to the scenario 3. And the scenario 3 is STEM OPT expiration is before the program start date and before the class start date. Now in this case, what should my service transfer date be? Now this is also a tricky scenario, because if you want to renew your job at the current company, then the current company should agree to this scenario. Maybe your program is not starting for a very long time after the STEM OPT expiration. Now anyways, you cannot work for your company after the STEM OPT expiration. Then the company job should be stopped and it should be renewed after you get the CPT I-20 after the program start date. So it is a tricky scenario if you are considering your employment dates. Now here in this case, just looking at the service transfer and being in status, the service transfer date should be within 60 days of your end date, and that end date is corresponding to usually the STEM OPT expiration date. And if you were not from a STEM background, then it is OPT end date or it is I-20 end date. Okay, so within the 60 days, it cannot go beyond 60 days. So that is the maximum you can go about. And the course start date should be within 5 months of the end date. Now here the end date, it's not referring to the service transfer date. It is referring to the OPT end date. So basically the distance between the OPT end date and the course start date is within 5 months. So this is the service transfer deadline in this particular scenario. And you need to understand here is that you cannot work after the STEM OPT expiration date. Your previous employment should end on the day of the STEM OPT expiration date. So these are multiple scenarios that I have explained regarding the service transfer out request, and you need to mention all those details and then submit the request to your college. And so I'm referring to the old college. The old college processes this request and they schedule the service transfer on the day of the service transfer date, and the service is transferred on that particular date. Then comes the CPT authorization date. So you are supposed to receive CPT I-20 before you can start working again for your previous employer or for the new employer. And you need to receive the I-20 either electronically or by hand, and that is also decided by the new school. So you need to ask your new school if you need to receive the I-20 electronically. Is electronically receiving I-20 sufficient to start work, or should I receive the I-20 in hand through mail before I can start working? You need to ask this question as well. Now after this, there is another request that you need to submit 14 business days before service transfer date, and that request is CPT pre-authorization request that is submitted to the new school, and I'll be talking about it in the next video section. So stay tuned.